What is going on, everybody? What is going on, the Catch fam? My name is John Dawson, and in today's video, we are hopping into our waiver wire ads for week 7 of the 2022 fantasy football season. If you guys do enjoy today's content, be sure to hit that like button on the way in. Hit that subscribe button, of course, if you are new to the channel. Really does help us out if you guys hit that like and consider subscribing. And feel free to drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below, and I'll get back to you as soon as I possibly can. Before we hop into the content, I do want to mention this is probably the worst waiver wire video we have thrown together throughout the whole year so far. It is not a great week for waiver wire additions. We'll talk more about it throughout the video, but on top of that, moving into week 7, we've got the Buffalo Bills, the Minnesota Vikings, the Philadelphia Eagles, and the Rams all on bye week. So some key players for a lot of fantasy rosters will be out in week 7 on bye. So we've got a lot to get into, and definitely some players that you're going to need to be considering in place of some potential big name starters. So without further ado, let's hop into today's video. All right, starting with the running back position, I've got Mike Boone first on the list. Not that the list is necessarily in any order, but he is rostered in 46% of fantasy leagues, and I would even consider making a move for Mike Boone heading into Monday Night Football. Obviously, at the time this video is being released, Monday Night Football has not been played yet, but heading into week 7, the Chargers are the worst team in the league against opposing running backs, and there's a strong chance that Melvin Gordon is not fully healthy in Monday Night Football. Moving into week 7, the Broncos will face the New York Jets, who actually look pretty good overall defensively, but the point being is that if Gordon is not healthy here in week 6, Mike Boone is going to be the lead back. And if he does well enough, and he did play very well in week 5 at 11.5 fantasy points. So if he plays well enough here in week 6, even if Melvin Gordon is on the field, if he carves out a strong enough role within this offense, we could definitely see some strong production out of Mike Boone in week 7. So like I said, Monday Night Football has not happened yet. That'll definitely impact Mike Boone overall, but I do think he is worth mentioning as we prepare for week 7. Moving on to Kenyon Drake. Listen, guys, I'm very hesitant here, right? You guys know with this Ravens backfield, I'm always back and forth. I really don't want to trust anyone, and we could see Gus Edwards return to action soon, as well as Justice Hill. And we all know that J.K. Dobbins is still in the mix here. He had 7 rushing attempts in week 6, but it was Kenyon Drake who got the bulk of the carries with 10 rushing attempts and made the most out of it in week 6 against the Giants. 119 rushing yards and a score that netted 19.7 fantasy points. So if you're absolutely desperate, I do think you could roll the dice on Kenyon Drake, but I don't necessarily love it. Like I said, guys, this is not a good week for waiver wire additions. It is absolutely not a good week for the running back position. We've got no Eno Benjamin going up against Seattle, even though he didn't play that great. We've got no Kenneth Walker, right? It is not a great week. Let's take a look at the Falcons running backs, right? Tyler Algier had 15 rushing attempts for 51 rushing yards in week 6 against San Francisco. Caleb Huntley had 16 rushing attempts for 59 rushing yards. Basically a 50-50 split here. And Caleb Huntley had 3.6 yards per carry, while Algier had 3.4 yards per carry. They both had under 6 fantasy points. So I don't love the floor and or ceiling moving into week 7 against Cincinnati. But with all these bye weeks coming up in week 7, Dalvin Cook's not going to be available. Darrell Henderson's not going to be available. Miles Sanders and Devin Singletary will not be available. So we got to throw these out there, because if one of these 2 running backs has an equivalent performance to what they did against San Francisco in week 6 and finds the end zone, they're going to throw together a respectable fantasy stat line. So we'll keep an eye on both the Falcons running backs, who look like they are in a strong committee at the moment. All right, let's talk about Deion Jackson of the Indianapolis Colts, who had a phenomenal day on the ground. 12 rushing attempts, 42 rushing yards, a score on the ground, and 10 targets, 10 receptions, 79 receiving yards. This man was balling out against Jacksonville, but he injured his quad. So there's a couple dynamics here, right? I mean, 28.1 fantasy points for Deion Jackson on the day, a phenomenal performance. Kudos to Jackson, but we don't know the health of Naheem Hines moving into week 7. He's been dealing with a concussion, and we don't know the health of Jonathan Taylor dealing with an ankle injury. But the dynamic we want to pay attention to here is that Deion Jackson has solidified himself as a solid handcuff to Jonathan Taylor. 13.1 points in week 5, 28.1 in week 6 for Jackson. There's no doubt that when JT is not on the field, Deion Jackson is going to be productive. So even if JT is good to go moving into week 7, Jackson is absolutely worth stashing as a handcuff. And even better, if JT misses week 7, Deion Jackson is probably a smash play. I think he will get the bulk of the touches, even if Nyheim Hines is healthy moving in to week 7. So a lot of uncertainty there with the Indianapolis Colts backfield, but we need to pay attention to all those different dynamics. All right, I threw Kyron Williams on the list today. He is owned in just 10% of fantasy leagues, according to the Sleeper app. At the moment, you can still move him on to your IR spot. So I think in deeper leagues, he's worth stashing right now with all of the trade buzz around Cam Akers departing from the Rams. When Williams is healthy, I would assume he is the number 2 on this team, and we all know that Sean McVay likes to rotate his running backs. The Rams spent decent enough draft capital on Williams that he might be a factor this season. And on top of that, Henderson has some injury history. So this is just because there's literally like no running backs to talk about this week. Threw this one on here. I'm not saying this is a move that a lot of you fantasy managers or majority fantasy managers are going to make, but it's definitely worth thinking about, especially in those really deep leagues out there. All right, moving on to the wide receiver position, we're talking about Alec Pierce. Again, double-digit fantasy performances in his last 3 games. 13.9 in week 6, 7 targets, 3 receptions, 49 receiving yards, and his first touchdown on the season. Guys, Alec Pierce is a top priority waiver wire addition. I loved him the last 2 weeks. I continue to love him. Moving into week 7 against Tennessee, who's been very bad against the wide receiver position, and Pierce himself had 12 points against Tennessee in week 7. Matt Ryan and Pierce have a very good chemistry overall. He is a top priority waiver wire addition at the wide receiver position, especially in full PPR scoring formats. All right, Josh Reynolds has made the list like every week of the season. The Lions had a bye week in week 6. They faced Dallas in week 7. Not a phenomenal matchup, but Reynolds still has double-digit fantasy performances in 4 out of his 5 matchups on the year and continues to have great chemistry with quarterback Jared Goff. He's only rostered in 41% of leagues at the moment. A little bit of a drop because of the bye week in week 6 for the Lions. So check in your leagues if Reynolds is available, especially in full PPR. He should be rostered. All right, we got a Giants wide receiver on the list, and it's a different one than the last 2 weeks. Imagine that. Wendell Robinson had a great day overall. 1 touchdown, 3 receptions, 37 receiving yards. Nothing crazy, but still a good outing for the young receiver who we have not seen in action since week 1. The Giants will face Jacksonville and Seattle before having a bye week in week 9. And man, this Giants team is playing good football right now. So we talked a lot this past week about what Giants receivers should take a look at and consider stashing. Robinson looks like he's going to be the guy. Darius Slayton came back to earth after having 13.9 points in week 5, just 2.8 in week 6. So I absolutely think Robinson, even if you're not confident enough in starting him in week 7, is worth an add moving into the week. Right, Tyquan Thornton of the New England Patriots is a move for deeper leagues, but he had 21.3 fantasy points in week 6 against Cleveland. The game script kind of benefited him here, but the Patriots will face Chicago, the Jets, and Indianapolis. Some decent matchups coming up. So deeper leagues, I think Thornton is worth a look at. Not my favorite add whatsoever on today's list, but definitely a player we want to keep on our radar. He looked good against the Browns overall. All right, Traquan Smith ended up being the wide receiver for the Saints, who had a good fantasy performance with Olave, Thomas, and Jarvis Landry out. I got a lot of questions going into Sunday about potentially starting Marquez Callaway, and I told you guys I don't think it's safe to assume that Callaway is going to have the best fantasy performance. He did have more targets, but Smith, 3 targets, 3 receptions, 43 receiving yards, and a touchdown. The Saints get Arizona in week 7 on a short week, Thursday Night Football, and I'm not quite sure that Thomas, Olave, and Landry will all be healthy. Even if just 1 or 2 of those guys is not healthy, Smith could see some added targets going into the week. And since he made the most out of his targets in week 6, I think he's worth a look, especially in deeper leagues. Once again, not my favorite move overall. Definitely a player to keep an eye on. All right, Donovan Peoples-Jones. The last 3 weeks, 12.1 points, 9 points, 11.6 points. He led the Browns in receiving in week 6. The Browns will face Baltimore in week 7. It's a great matchup overall. Baltimore has not played good against wide receivers so far on the season. So I think Peoples-Jones is a player we can take a look at. I never trusted him in fantasy, but so far through the first 6 games of the season, he is double digits in half of his games. So he's worth a look for a flex play, but he's still going to be very inconsistent. All right, so far at the time I'm filming this, the Dallas Cowboys are not playing great football tonight, but we need to keep an eye on Michael Gallup and Noah Brown moving into week 7 because they face the Detroit Lions. Michael Gallup is rostered in 63% of fantasy leagues, while Noah Brown is rostered in just 16%, right? We're probably going to see Dak Prescott back at the quarterback position in week 7 against the Detroit Lions, who are giving up a ton of points. Overall, their defense is playing atrocious. So keep an eye on Gallup, keep an eye on Noah Brown. If they're available in your league, they could be due for higher ceilings moving into week 7 overall. All right, moving into week 7, we've got no Jalen Hurts. We've got no captain, you like that, Kirk Cousins. We got no Matthew Stafford, which I hope none of you guys are starting anyways. And we've got no Josh Allen. So 2 absolute stud quarterbacks, and still 2 quarterbacks that I've seen starting for a lot of you guys, even if they're not Jalen Hurts or Josh Allen. So regardless, we need to keep an eye on a couple quarterbacks moving into week 7 because there is a high chance you're going to need to stream a quarterback moving into week 7. Jimmy Garoppolo has 18 fantasy points in his last 2 performances, and he gets Kansas City, whose secondary has been pretty vulnerable overall. This is a team that's given up a decent amount of points throughout the year. So I like Jimmy Garoppolo moving into week 7. I think he's a solid streaming option because he presents a very safe floor. So if he's available, I just think he's safe. We can roll with Jimmy G and not have to worry about it here in week 7. Matt Ryan, I have not trusted whatsoever in fantasy football throughout the season, but his second best performance of the year was week 4 against Tennessee. And obviously he had his best fantasy performance here in week 6 at 27 fantasy points, 389 passing yards, 3 touchdowns, and he faces Tennessee in week 7. So I do think you can stream Matt Ryan if you need to, but I'm still having a little bit of an issue trusting him. But with those 2 aspects together, I do think that Matt Ryan is worth a stream if you need to do so in week 7. Danny Dimes, man, playing good football. Nothing crazy here. Not good ceilings, right? 13.5 or less fantasy points in his last 2 games, but he did have 2 scores against Baltimore. The ceilings aren't good here. Don't get me wrong. I understand, but Jacksonville looked pretty vulnerable on defense going up against the Colts. Matt Ryan, who we just talked about, and Daniel Jones gets Seattle in week 8, another defense that's been playing abysmal. Then a bye week, Houston and Detroit. So I think there's some pretty safe floors coming up for Daniel Jones if you are in need of a quarterback to stream. Marcus Mariota had his best fantasy performance of the season in week 6, 24.1 points. And he did against one of the best defenses in the league, the San Francisco's 49ers. 14 passing attempts, 13 completions, 129 passing yards, 2 scores, 50 yards off of 6 rushing attempts, and a touchdown on the ground. So I like what we saw out of Mariota in week 6, but it's another relatively tough matchup going up against Cincinnati in week 7. He's not my favorite start. I don't see as safe of a floor necessarily, but if you need to roll with Mariota, I think it's perfectly fine moving into week 7. All right, let's talk about Evan Ingram, who I have continued to encourage you guys to use as a streaming option at the tight end position. 9 points overall against the Colts in week 6, 5 receptions, 40 receiving yards. So nothing crazy out of Ingram on the season. Week 5, 12.9 fantasy points, so we're seeing enough consistency that he's a strong streaming option. He gets the Giants in week 7. He's a good enough streaming option that we can consider him in week 7 if you're without Tyler Higbee, without Dallas Goedert, without Irv Smith, and even without Dawson Knox, right? Robert Tonyan had his best fantasy performance of the season in week 6, 19 fantasy points in full PPR, 10 receptions off of 12 targets, 90 receiving yards. It's Washington in week 7. They've been pretty good against opposing tight ends, but I still think Robert Tonyan is worth the look as this Packers offense is starting to not look so great. Do you think that Aaron Rodgers is going to continue to target the pass catchers that he trusts overall? So I think Tonyan is worth a look moving into week 7. We got to talk about Daniel Bellinger of the New York Giants, who had 14.8 fantasy points in week 5, a touchdown through the air, 5 receptions off 5 targets, 38 receiving yards after having 10.4 points in week 5. Like I said, man, this Giants offense is playing well. This Giants unit is playing good. This is a good Giants football team, and they've got a very favorable schedule coming up. So all I'm saying is if you're in an absolute pickle and you need to take a dart throw, I don't necessarily trust Bellinger, but the last 2 weeks have given us enough confidence, and the upcoming matchups give us even more confidence to take a chance on Bellinger moving into week 7. 2 other tight ends that you can take a look at if you absolutely don't have better options would be Hunter Henry and Noah Fant. As long as it's full PPR scoring formats, they've given us slight confidence in the last 2 weeks and safe enough floors that we can consider Fant or Henry moving into week 7 if you need a deep streaming option. And that'll do it for today's video. If you guys did enjoy the content today, be sure to hit that like button on the way out. Hit that subscribe button, of course, if you're new to the channel. Really does help us out if you guys hit that like and consider subscribing. Feel free to drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below, and I'll get back to you as soon as I possibly can. Make sure to check out all of our links down below and look out for our next fantasy Q&A live stream. We would love to have you there. With that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening, and remember, you saw it here on The Catch.